Greetings from Tokyo, my dear friends. This is Daisuke, and how are you doing today? I hope you are doing very well today. So, I have been very fortunate over the course of the past week or so to have been able to receive this set from the Criterion collection. This is the Godzilla Showa era films 1954 to 1975, spine number 1000. I have also been very fortunate to have been able to make some comments about my views on this set, and I think it is overall a really great set, although I do acknowledge that there are some issues with the set that I think are worth discussing. One of those issues concerns the English language versions of the films. The issue of the English language versions of the films is specifically with respect to what films on the set have also available through the set, the English language versions of that film. Now, as you may know already, the set from Criterion here, as great as it is, only provides the English language versions of some of the films, not all, but some of the films. So what are they? So the first film that's offered with an English language version is the original Godzilla. So Godzilla comes with the 1956 Godzilla King of the Monsters, which was the US release version, and it's not only an English language version, but in many respects it's a different film in that it has additional footage. There are some edits being made. Certain changes from the original Japanese version are being made in order to cater, the theory being, in order to cater to a US audience at the time. So that is the English language version of the original Godzilla. Okay, and then we go to King Kong versus Godzilla. So what we have on the set is, as the main attraction for the film, we have the US release of that film, and this was under the guidance and production of John Beck, who took the original Japanese film and had it re-edited in some places, had certain new footage added in order to change the pacing of the film, etc. And other changes were made to the music and to the certain sound effects that were being used and the like. So that is, in many respects, a different film than the original Japanese version of King Kong vs. Godzilla. So King Kong vs. Godzilla was released in Japan. The Japanese version was released in Japan in 1962. And then the US release version was released in 1963. So this is again, an English language version of the film, albeit a different edit of the film. And then we go to 1965, which is Invasion of Astro Monster. Now, the film Invasion of Astro Monster is the Japanese cut of the film, but as it's being offered here under the Criterion collection, it's being offered with an alternate English language soundtrack. So what that means is, unlike Godzilla, and unlike King Kong vs. Godzilla, this time with Invasion of Astro Monster, what you're getting the Japanese cut, but with the option of listening to the English soundtrack of over that cut. So so you're getting the same film, but a different soundtrack. You can choose Japanese or English. The same is true for the film Son of Godzilla. You're getting the Japanese version of the film, but with optional tracks, the English language soundtrack or the original Japanese language soundtrack. And then you're getting the same thing for Destroy All Monsters, then the same thing for Godzilla vs. Megalon, Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla, and Terror of Mechagodzilla. So you are getting the same film, but with the alternate language tracks. So this is a kind of interesting situation here, because what this means is this set, the Criterion set, does not offer any English language version, whether it be an alternate English language soundtrack to the Japanese film or a totally different edit in English for the following films: Godzilla Raids Again, Mothra vs. Godzilla, Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster, Ebirah Horror of the Deep, All Monsters Attack, Godzilla vs. Hedorah, and Godzilla vs. Gigan. Okay, so what does this mean for this set? I think it can be seen in a number of different ways depending on one's point of view. On the one hand, for I think many people in the US, and let's say outside of Japan, for instance, let's take the US and North America as an example, I think, of course, for many years, perhaps the only way to have been able to watch the Godzilla films, the Showa era films, were through the US release versions of the films. And so I think that means either a completely different edit of the film or an English dub over a certain international version of the film or something to that effect. So what this means is that for many people who are fans of Godzilla in North America, for example, I think people have become fans of the films through the English language versions, whatever they may be. So that is a very legitimate approach. That is a very reasonable approach to have to Godzilla films. And so therefore, if you are someone who has that approach or who prefers that approach, then I think this set can be seen as somewhat of a disappointment. It is not a complete disappointment, of course, because it does include English language versions of some of the films, but it would be a disappointment in the sense that it does not include the English language versions of all of the films. So in that sense, I think this set could be seen as being a little bit weak in terms of this lack of a complete presentation of the English language versions. Okay. Now, I should point out very quickly before I continue is that what is interesting is that for the most part, the films that do not have English language versions made available through the Criterion Collection actually have English language versions made available elsewhere. And so what do I mean by this? So for example, the film Godzilla Raids Again, the English language version, which used to be called Gigantus the Fire Monster, but has been retitled for purposes of this classic media DVD, is available through this DVD. It's a different cut of the film, and so in many ways it is a different movie, although it does borrow many elements and it follows rather faithfully the original Japanese cut. So in many ways this is much like the Godzilla and Godzilla King of the Monsters type of situation here. Then we have a different English dub cut for Mothra vs. Godzilla. And then we have the same thing for Ghidorah the Three-Headed Monster. And then we have something really interesting, which is the classic media DVDs include a different English dub version of the film Invasion of Astro Monster. Now, please recall that actually Invasion of Astro Monster is available with an alternate English language soundtrack for its Japanese cut, which is available here. This does not, let's be clear here, the Criterion Collection does not offer any alternate cut of the film which is an English language version, which is different from the classic media DVD in that this presents not a soundtrack in English over the Japanese cut, but rather it presents a different English dub version, which is a different cut from the original Japanese version. So it's an interesting situation with Invasion of Astro Monster here. So if you are curious about a different cut of the film versus getting the Japanese cut with an English language soundtrack, if you're interested in looking at a different English language cut of the film, then you might be interested in tracking down this classic media DVD of Invasion of Astro Monster. Then returning to the other titles, so we have All Monsters Attack, which is another classic media DVD, and this has a different cut of the film in English. And then we have Terror of Mechagodzilla, which is a similar situation to Invasion of Astro Monster, in that Terror of Mechagodzilla, as it appears in this Criterion release, does have the Japanese cut, and also the option of listening to the Japanese cut with an English language soundtrack. So it's that you have the alternate soundtrack option with respect to Terror of Mechagodzilla. However, for this classic media DVD release, you are getting the English dub version, which is a different cut from the original Japanese version. The history of there have been actually a number of English cuts of this, not just the one that appears on the classic media DVD release, but for purposes of it, I think a simple comparison, I think having just this, I think, is very, very helpful if you are interested in what the differences are between the original Japanese cut and one of the more well-known English dub cuts of this particular film. But in any event, my friends, once again, let me just say that the classic media DVD offers a different English language cut of the film, whereas Criterion offers an English language soundtrack to the Japanese cut of the film. So if you're interested in a different cut of the film, then it might be worth tracking down the classic media DVD. Then I should mention the other films that don't have English language versions appearing on the Criterion set, but have English language versions outside of the Criterion collection. So we have the film Ebirah, Core of the Deep, which is available through Kraken Releasing. And then we have the film Godzilla vs. Hedorah, also available through Kraken. These two happen to be Blu-rays. And here's another Kraken Blu-ray, this time Godzilla vs. Gigan. So these are, how should I put it? These are English language versions of the films that have Japanese optional audio tracks available for them. So you are getting, in a sense, both an English language version and a Japanese language version. Although I should be very clear, the prints that are being relied upon for these particular releases do not exactly match the Japanese versions that we see in the Criterion Collection set here. There are some subtle differences that are occurring between the versions that we see here and the versions that we see in the Criterion set. And I should be very clear, the Criterion set presents the Japanese versions of each of the films. So if you're looking for an English language version of one of these three films, you can check out the Kraken Releasing Blu-rays, which are here in front of me. But please note that they won't necessarily be exactly the same as the Japanese cuts of the films. There are some subtle differences, which I think are pretty interesting. But for the most part, you are getting something that is more or less close to what the Japanese cuts are. So, with that, my friends, this is the issue of the English dub releases, or I should be more clear, the English language versions of the Godzilla Showa era films as they appear in the set. So, as I was saying earlier, I think for those of us who have the view that Godzilla films are they can be appreciated through the English language versions of the respective films, I think this set might be somewhat of a disappointment because of the lack of English language versions for some of the films. But I should point out that I personally don't think that this is a major flaw. In fact, I would say that of the flaws of the set, and I do acknowledge that there are a number of other flaws in the set, I think this is a fairly minor one or small one, at least from my point of view. And let me explain. Now, I come at this from the perspective that I rely on the Japanese cuts of the films. My own personal bias is that I personally think that in general the Japanese cuts of the films are usually the superior versions. That's not to say that the English language versions of the films are poor or they are always inferior. I think there is a nice, for example, with King Kong versus Godzilla, I think there is a nice debate that one can have in one's head. I do it as well, as to what version is superior. I would say basically I think the Japanese version of that film is superior, although I do acknowledge that the US release version of that film is very, very good, and there are times when I actually think it is superior to the original Japanese cut. So this is just by way of example, me trying to emphasize that I do respect the US release versions or the English language versions of these films. And I do find that they do provide a nice basis for comparative analysis and study, at the very least, just to see a kind of historical perspective as to what kinds of details were emphasized over others with respect to certain markets and theatrical showings of films for this particular part of the world versus that particular part of the world. What were some of the cultural concerns or sociological concerns that compelled a distributor to make a certain change here versus the original Japanese version over there? So, and these sorts of types of analyses, I think, are born out of the ability of being able to watch both versions or more than one version of the same film. So I completely get that, and I think that kind of analysis is valuable. Don't get me wrong, I do value that. So in that sense, I do value the existence of, or the ability of being able to see the English language versions of the films. That being said, I still think that the Japanese language versions, the Japanese cuts, the original Toho cuts of the films as they are presented here, and then in the case of King Kong versus Godzilla as a supplement on disc 8, I think those versions are, generally speaking, the superior versions. They're the ones that I am used to the most, and I admit that I am not necessarily as familiar with the films through the English language versions as I am through the Japanese language versions. So that's my own bias showing. But once again, I do respect and admire very much anyone who is a fan of the films through the English language versions. I do respect that very much. But for me, I hope I'm making myself clear, which is that I do love the films primarily through the Japanese versions. So therefore, to have Godzilla presented in the Criterion set for the first time, I think, in North America, the Japanese versions of the films. You can actually see the Japanese versions of the films with the Japanese titles and the actual cuts as they were shown in Japan theatrically, etc. I think that's a really big deal, and so you can listen to the characters speaking in the original language for the most part. Of course, there are some interesting exceptions to that, but for the most part, you can hear the language in Japanese, of course, and so I think that goes a long way in one's feelings as one is watching the film. There's one other thing I should say, which is that I think one thing that could be said about this set is that it would have been really interesting and helpful if Criterion could have made some kind of supplement or documentary whereby it had a Godzilla historian talk to us about the various release histories and version histories of each of the films. I think that would have been really great and really interesting just to get a sense of it. At the very least, as a kind of substitute for the lack of the English language versions of each of the films, or for some of the films. I think that would have been really interesting. But my hunch is, much like the situation of this particular set itself, my hunch is that it has all to do with licensing and the inability of getting the license rights from whoever the license holders may be, that prevented Criterion from maybe making such documentaries or supplements. And also perhaps, that's my speculation of course, but it's my assumption or my guess that it had something to do with the inability to get the proper licensing rights that prevented Criterion from being able to present all of the English language versions that were available for each of the films. So that's the speculation, right? So in other words, Criterion did the best it could with the licensing rights that it had and it held. So it did the very best it could, but unfortunately, perhaps, again, this is speculation, that due to licensing rights, it could not present all of the films in the English language versions that it would have otherwise wanted to, I would assume. I should also point out that the fact that we don't get the English language versions or different cuts of the films of all the films, I don't think is necessarily a bad thing in the context of a Criterion release. And I can only defend my position by relying on just a number of examples, or let me rely on one example, which is the film Kagemusha, which was released in the Criterion collection on a DVD and on a Blu-ray, the film by Akira Kurosawa, released in 1980. Now, I don't know if you know this, but actually the film Kagemusha had a Japanese cut, and there was actually also an international cut. In other words, the film was re-edited slightly for purposes of showing overseas. And some of you may know this. The international cut is slightly shorter, I think, than the Japanese cut. It excises one particular subplot of the film, which appears in the Japanese version, but it doesn't appear in the international cut. And there are also some slight edits or trimmings made to certain battle scenes and the like. And so the runtime has been condensed to, I think, about 120 minutes versus the much longer running time for the Japanese version. The Criterion release of Kagemusha, as far as I recall, is the Japanese cut of the film. It is not the international cut. And my further recollection is that the international cut is not included in the Kagemusha Criterion release. So that's an interesting thing, right? Because I think for a lot of people in North America, for example, who knew the film Kagemusha, they probably knew the film through the international cut and not through the Japanese cut. But then when Criterion released it, it was the Japanese cut. And Kagemusha, Kurosawa film, it is another Toho film, actually, also, I should point out. So this is just an example of a sort of high-profile film that was released, a Japanese film that was released by the Criterion Collection, that did not include the different international cut of that same film. And so a similar case can be made with the Godzilla films. I think it's not necessarily an automatic detriment that the set does not include all of the international cuts for all of the films. But then again, I do want to acknowledge that I do appreciate the viewpoint of many people out there who yearn for the English language versions of all the films, who want to have everything in a comprehensive set, because I think the reach of Godzilla and the sort of appeal of Godzilla to an international audience is reliant to a significant degree on the international release versions, or the North American release versions, or other parts of the world, etc. Right. So And of course, I didn't even acknowledge the fact that there are other versions of many of these films apart from the English language versions, right? So there are other European territories. There's a very there are many versions of the film Godzilla alone, and so that has a rich history in as far as the different release versions are concerned. So how do I round off this discussion then? I round it off by returning to my original point, which is, for me personally, I don't think that this issue of the English language versions as it appears in the set, I don't think it's a problem for me. I'm okay with it. But I do appreciate how it could be an issue for other people. I do appreciate that. What I can suggest for those of you who are seeking out the English language versions, or at least some of them, for the films that do not appear here, is try to find those classic media DVDs if you can. Try to seek out those Kraken releases if you can, and try to find other versions of the film which are, I think, available through various means, online and elsewhere. So you can look this stuff up and you can track it down. Again, I hope you have much success with that if you are interested in that. But going back to the Criterion set, let's remember that we are getting the original Japanese versions of the film. Once again, we are getting the original Japanese versions of each of the films. And I think that is really great. I think that is wonderful because this is, I mean, one way to think of it is these are Japanese films. And so it's one way to think about it is that I think it's fitting to watch a Japanese film based off of the cut that was relied upon for the initial release in Japan. That's what we get here. So for all the films. And so is it a perfect set? Is it a complete set? No. But is it a worthwhile set? And is it a very impactful set because of the presentation of the Japanese versions? Yes. And so therefore, my friends, I really find the set to be wonderful. And I do not find this issue of the English language versions to be detrimental, at least in terms of my own enjoyment of this particular set. Okay, my friends, that's it for now, but if you have any thoughts or comments with respect to this set, please feel free to let me know in the comment section below. I would love to hear what it is you have to think. Other than that, my friends, I hope you are happy and healthy and well, and that you continue to watch a lot of great movies. So until we meet again, my friends, cheers.